good timing for the late entrant. He's missed anything. So yeah, you've got that first process in other recordings anyway, but once you get into this Power Query editor, you're going to need to click Convert to Table, and that'll bring up this little icon here that expands all of the columns into a table rather than one column. So when I click on that, it brings up all of those field names that we saw when we tried it out. Unfortunately, it doesn't bring them all up. Again, software development wise, someone thought it was really good that you might hide some, so you have to actually click Load More. And then the other thing you want to do is remove this original column name prefix, because the original column name in this instance is column1, which we don't want all of these to be column1.id. So we just untick that and then we click OK. And basically all of these columns now appear with a sample record from UniPhi coming directly out of the UniPhi application. We have to go across and tell the system what the data types are. But before we do that, you can see some of the columns are sub tables, and so you need to expand them as well. And I will say that you probably want to be a little bit picky as to what you take. Now that we've got the column called project, we actually want to know that's the project column, so we tick this back on and it'll say project.id, project.projid.name, etc. We want to click the load more potentially, but in this instance I don't. All I want out of this is the ID, because I want to join this to other tables potentially, the project ID, which is what you see in UniPhi. This is the database ID, and this is the name. And the rest I'm just going to leave because I don't need it for what I'm trying to do. You might, that's fine. And I click OK, and it basically gives me 3 more columns of that information. Now, there's one more section in this API endpoint that does that, and it's the task, which I've probably just gone past and didn't notice it. There it is. And so you can see whenever you see that, instead of a little drop down, which is a filter, basically enables you to do filtering on it if it's got the little drop down. This is a task, and I'm expanding the task. And again, I want task to be the prefix, so I keep that ticked. I click load more to see if there's anything missing. And then again, I want to be a little bit picky. The reason you want to be a bit picky is when you get into timesheets, you can sometimes have large data sets, and you don't necessarily want to load everything that you don't need. All I need is the task description. You can see that tasks come from different sources in UniPhi. So this gives you an idea of the UniPhi system. You can set up standard tasks. You can have contract deliverables, and you have contract variations, and people can timesheet to those. If you wanted to connect to those other tables related to this, you might need to keep these IDs, but for this particular exercise, I don't need to worry. And then if I did want to do some analysis around billable utilization, I can tick these as well, which I'll do, and I click OK. And so that brings those columns in. And so now we're ready just to go back to the beginning and quickly select, and you only do this once, by the way. This is just setting it up, and then you can copy this file and do other things and whatever. So I go through and I basically say, okay, this ID is actually a whole number, so I need to put data types in for this stuff. Same with the project ID, it's a whole number. And that's important because I'm going to join these things to other tables later on. Where there's text, and proj ID tends to be text, some people it's a number, but generally it tends to be text. I just leave it as ABC 1, 2, 3. Other people might know that it's more beneficial to select the text data type, but see there is a text data type, but I just leave it alone. Saves me time from clicking the drop down. I get bored easily. And so that one's there, and then organization ID in case I need to get more organization information, etc., as we go across. You'll see that these are true false fields, and so there's a true false data type, so you can select those. And then this is a date field, so we just select date, whereas this one has a time element to it, so we select date time. Then we come across to the hours, and they're going to be decimal number, because you can have a fraction of an hour, but it's not currency, and it's not a whole number because you can have a fraction. Is submitted is a true false, is approved is a true false. The charge rate is a currency, and you can actually format that into foreign currencies. Same with cost rate and salary, which you probably didn't need. And again, that's text, I'll just leave alone, and I'll leave that one alone. So now we've basically finished our first transformational element to this thing. But what you'll see is in this particular API endpoint, there's no total. So we give you the rate and we give you the hours, but there's no total. So you might want to actually add that in if you're going to do any aggregates on the total cost. And to do that, you can go to the add column ribbon. So I was in home, I just went to the add column, click custom function, and then it's really quite total cost, total charge. You might do both, but I'll just do total cost. It's you know, use your sort of Excel kind of knowledge, but here's your fields over here. You can double click on them. So we know we need hours. And then we're going to have a time symbol. Don't worry about this little error, because as soon as I put the cost rate in, it'll go away. No syntax error. Click OK. And I've now got a column here that's timesing, you know, the $40 by the 5 hours to get 200. That's a currency again, and I'm now done. So you can do those sorts of things both in Power BI and in Excel via the Power Query editor. In Power BI, you can also create measures, but once you've done this through the Power BI interface, or in Excel, you can just use Excel functions once you've done this as well. And so that's finished that particular job. If I go back to the home, you'll see there's this close and load button. And so I click close and load, and I've now got all of the Excel information ready to go. And yes, you can definitely. There's a question, you can probably, hopefully, I was direct to me. The question was, you can filter, and I'll just go back in and show that. So another element of this Power Query is there's a subset of the data that you want to analyze. You can actually filter it here. And so if I, to go back into Power Query, you can see that I've now got a tab here called timesheets, got a nice table of information. And I've got this query and connections thing over here with 8,000 rows loaded. If I double click on that, it takes me back into the Power Query editor. And you can see all your steps here. And as I mentioned here, you can actually filter. So if you only wanted to analyze business development, you could actually unselect all of that, just select that, and it'll just load business development into that Excel. So you do quite a lot of manipulation in Power Query. You can then also subsequently do them after you've loaded, because you can still see you've got those filters here as well. So it's up to you. The difference being that if you filter it before it gets into Excel, it'll be a little bit better performing. And so now I've got that data in here. The benefit of this whole process is that if I go and you know, do something, I just have to refresh this page and the data comes in. If I go and do something in UniPhi, so once I've set that up once, I can save it as a file. And if I go back into my UniPhi application, I can come in here and start to do things, and you know, it'll flow through to the Excel version just by clicking that little refresh button over here. And so you can see it's hovered up with refresh, it's hovered up with a pop-up table telling me all the things that are in there. And I can just hit that refresh, and you can see it's loading the data, and I get my new data set. You can then obviously do a whole bunch of stuff with this data, including pivot tables and graphs and the like, which I'm going to do in a moment, but just pausing there for a moment. I just wanted to sort of remind you of what the old process would have been. So in the hamburger in UniPhi and reports, these are what we call Microsoft SQL reporting services reports. These have been here since 2003, this concept. They've upgraded the technology a bit. But what we used to do back then, before these Power Query editor things existed, is we used to create these reports called export. And what that meant was that instead of it having a header that told you what you were looking at, it just was like a data dump. And in timesheets, you know, there's a timesheet export report. And what I'm proposing in this webinar is that you can actually replace this process that you might have been using, where you export to Excel and you click view and it creates an Excel file, with the Power Query editor instead. The reason that it's much better is that to refresh that information, I have to run that report every time, and then I'd have to, you know, highlight the text and paste it into my standard template that's got all the pivot queries and everything else. I mean, that's not huge overhead, but it's got potential of error. You might paste into an area that has more rows. You've got 449 rows here. You paste into an area with 700. You don't see that that's an error, and you have extra records in there that you're not expecting and things like that. So this is a far more robust and streamlined connection from Excel to UniPhi than using our old method of using export-based reports. But it might be of interest to know, at least, that when you go into reports and you see that word export, that's what it's been designed to do, is just dump out as a flat file. It quickly opens up into Excel, as a nice table to do stuff with. Just close that. And I'll check my notes. Okay, and so I mentioned before, once you're in here, you've got all of your traditional Excel functions. The most common one with this tabular data set is to create a pivot table. And you'll see that it already knows the range. So there's no highlighting. As long as you're in the table, it highlights the whole range, and you click OK. And you've now got your canvas for doing your timesheet analysis. It's just one table at the moment. And I can, then select a, project name as a row and a person name underneath, and come down to hours, chuck that in the values section. And I've got people's hours per project that I can look at. Pivot tables have the ability to pivot that and a chart, and you could have that charted. You can see with the pivot chart over here and do what you want. What else? But one of the things I can't do here, and a query came in from a client around this the other day, I can't get any other data that doesn't exist in this table as it stands. But one of the really cool things about PowerQuery is that I can actually connect to other tables in the API, join them together, and then get extra information. Now, in this instance, the information we're looking for at the moment, I know of the person, but I don't know anything more about that person. And so what UniPhi has in its data model, and therefore through the API, is what we call metadata tables, sometimes called dimensions in other systems. So let's just metadata tables, which are tables that describe other sort of transactional tables. So timesheets are transactional. There's lots of transactions of people's timesheets, but those people and those projects, they have a whole heap of information that describes them. The person has a classification and a role and a employment type, etc. And that information is all stored in the person describing that particular person. And so same with the project. The project has a sector, it has a project type, a service line, and obviously both of those tables have custom filled tables that hang off that mean you can actually generate unlimited extra metadata to capture information. And so here we look down this list again, and you can see I've got the person endpoint there. What you'll find is that a transactional table will have many person IDs or many project IDs, and the metadata table will just have one row for each of those records. And that's a one-to-many relationship. And that's what you really need to actually get the Power Query editor to work. And so, as a pop quiz, there's quite a few things here. These two are quite unique. And I think I was going to go into it in this webinar, but I don't think it's going to be enough time. Plus, I think it's probably a little bit far-reaching. So we'll ignore these two. But if we looked at these three and using the comment text chat thing in Zoom, what I'm asking is, for these three tables, which one is a meta table that describes the budget, and which one is transactional? Which ones are transactional out of that? So if people want to have a crack, there's only three there. You've got the budget table, you've got the budget snapshot table, and you've got the budget version table. So we want to know which ones of those are transactional and which ones are sort of meta. Or the other way to say would be, there's only one record for a particular thing, and then there's lots of records for that particular thing in the other table. Okay, anyone else? We've got one vote. Come on, guys, have a crack. I won't out you. Talk on the chat. You can do direct message if you like. Man, I'll either put you all to sleep or you're just not interested. You could do this get query that I showed you before again. And what you're basically looking at is where these IDs repeat. And if they are, then the chances are they're transactional. And what you'll find in UniPhi, where it gets a little bit complex, and we've done this on purpose, to save you having to connect to tables, lots of tables all the time, is we've actually put a bit of metadata in the one table, so they're a little bit bloated. You can actually get, but what that means is that it repeats the same thing over and over again when it doesn't really need to. And so you can see that 452 project repeats down the page, right? So that's going to be transactional because it repeats down the page. Whereas in the budget version, now it still may have project ID coming down the page, but there's only one version and it's describing that version for you. So it's really the meta. It's going to have one version ID in its particular thing that will connect to the budget snapshot as being one. Whereas projects can have lots of different budgets, and you can connect to that via the project table, which has the meta describing that budget is for this project, even though we have that project name displayed in this as a way of a quick way of there's a project name there describing that. But it's important to think when you're connecting these two up, which one's the one that's describing what I'm looking at, and which one's got lots of records that give it, that I'm going to sum and aggregate information up, like the total budget you're going to sum up, you're going to total the number of hours of the person. So the person is the one and the hours is the many. The budget version is the one and the budget is the many. So that's, oh, wow. Am I still on? I've just been told I've been signed out.
You're still there.
Zoom just said I've been signed out. I think it was because a colleague of mine just logged in over the top of me. But everyone can still hear me, right?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right. Oh man, that was fun. All right, so moving on from that little pop quiz, what we're going to do now is we're going to connect to another endpoint so that I can get the casual employee. So this request was, we need to send, and it's not really a pivot table that's required, it's actually a subset of this information. We need to send to our payroll people casual staff and how many hours they've done in a week. All right. Now we could have gone and written a report specifically for that. Would have taken a week, might have cost them some money, but they can actually do that themselves, and that's what we're going to do right now. So we've already got the timesheet information, but what we don't have is the employment type. And so now first explain that and how that sort of comes about is in UniPhi, again, in the configuration element of the system, you can establish a whole heap of metadata, data that describes time. And sorry, it's not just in here, it's in the, I've gone with the wrong one there, it's in the resources section. So in the resources section of the hamburger, you've got these sub navigations come up eventually. And they help you do a whole bunch of stuff. People, use UniPhi to capture rates on people's time in different ways. You can do it against the person directly and just type it in and you've calculated it somewhere else. You can give people a classification and they inherit the rate that you put in and the weekly hours that they have and whether they need the timesheet or not from this table here. Or you can build it up and have UniPhi calculate the rate for you. And that's where these two sub-navigations come in. And even perhaps you don't need to, you're just going to use this particular thing to differentiate the type of person. So you've got an ability to add and label these yourself. And you can see here, we've got 50% part-time, we've got casual, full-time, what have you. And then when you create a person, you can associate which employment type they're under. And you can see there's a number of hours per year that goes into those things. And that's how you can then start to build up a rate through that process. But for this particular purpose, all we're doing is saying there's these different employment types, and I'm going to want to filter out just for people who are casual so that I can send this report to payroll once a week. So we know what the structure is now. It's called employment type. We know it's going to be against a person. So what I need to do is, and what I'm trying to emphasize there is you kind of need to know how UniPhi structures the data to know how the API is going to give it to you. I can now go to the data endpoint. I can go to the from web again. It's the same process as before and put my URL in. What you missed is if you did this the first time, it would pop up with a login for you to log in, and you select the basic option to do that. And you put your normal UniPhi username and password in. If you've got single sign-on with Office 365, you would need to remember your actual UniPhi login, not the Office 365 account, because there's no single sign-on into this Power Query editor. So that could be a challenge, but yeah, that's what you need to do to connect. So I've just put in the person endpoint. So it's going to give me the same wizard that I had earlier. So if you joined late, you're going to still hear everything. See everything run again, even though I forgot to press record early enough. And it's the same process. So I'll just do this real quick. What you'll see in this one a little bit differently is I actually don't want everything. I've already got the person's name, but I need to join on the ID. And all I'm really looking for, and again, I have to click this load more to get it to display, which is really annoying, but anyway, I'm sure there's lots of UniPhi things as well. So I don't bag out software too much anymore now that I create it. There's this employment type. And so that's what I want. And so I'm just going to do that just so it's nice and simple and just 2 columns and I don't have to worry about all the other data. And I click OK. And that's going to be a whole number. This is text. You can see it's got one that's full time there. And here, as Karen mentioned earlier, you can actually then also strip out. I'm just going to strip out all the nulls, which is most of it in this dummy database. And so we haven't got many people, but it demonstrates the concept. And we've got 2 casual staff there. And now I can close and load that. And so now I've got 2 tables in my Excel system over here, but they're not actually related. I need to tell the system how they're related. And so in the data ribbon again, now, depending on your screen resolution, this can come up as a tiny little icon, just a tip for young players. Some people find it hard to find. It just basically has the symbol, but this one's nice and big and it says relationships. And you can click on that and click new, and you can do a marriage ceremony basically on person and timesheet. The key is what you need to sort of know, but it's the ID. It's always going to be the ID field. And so that's the person ID field to the timesheet table. And you then have to look for person ID, which hopefully you can see is there. And so now they're related in happy matrimony. And I can close that. And then if I come back to that power, so there's a couple of things you can do then. You can actually combine the, merge the 2 data sets into one if you wanted to, and that would just create a nice table that you could then send to finance. I'm going to do the Power Query combination, get it right, Mark, the pivot table combination instead. And so you can see here, I'm back in my pivot table. If I scroll down, because I got 2 tables now, a little more table dot comes in, and I click that, and this is going to create a new pivot table. It says can't add it to this one. Computer says no. So I click yes, and so it's duplicated. I've got 2 pivot tables now, sheet 2 and sheet 3. But the sheet 3 has the 2 tables together. And so what I can do is I can just drop the employment type down into the filter and click on that and expand that and go casual and click OK. And now I've got the casual hours. If I remove the project, it'll kind of be in a nice sort of table that I can put off to my payroll. If it needs to be CSV, you can file save as CSV, and it'll say it's only going to save that particular sheet and then send that file off to payroll, whatever you want to do. So that's pretty much the overview of how to use Power Query Editor. Happy to take a Q&A, which is usually as popular as that pop quiz that I did. But also got a couple of little things to mention after that, so you don't all just disappear on me. We're still only 35 minutes in on an hour webinar. I wasn't sure how long that was going to take. Hopefully I didn't go too fast, and you'll have the recording to step through it to get an idea. Just as actually, there was one other thing I was going to demonstrate. So we've got Alex Rose 184 hours here. Again, just to demonstrate that last benefit of what we've just done as opposed to the old methodology. If I go back into the UniPhi system, go to Alex Rose, I can come in here. Let's just put some hours in for him. Oh, not 76, a bit much. And submit that. So we just put in 35 hours. So that should be going up to 219. And so what I'll need to do though is refresh the timesheet thing. So to do that, I go back to my timesheet table. You've got that little refresh thing there. You can see it's loading the data. If I'd added more people, I'd have to refresh both. You can probably refresh them all in one go. But I've just refreshed the timesheets. Now, when I come back to sheet 3, it still says 184, and you go, oh, well, that's because you have to actually refresh the pivot table as well, which is a little bit annoying as well. But if I hit refresh here, we're now at 219. Yay. That is a lot easier, hitting 2 refresh buttons, than having to run that timesheet export report, dump it out to Excel, copy paste it into some other spreadsheet, then refresh your Power Pivot query, and hopefully not have missed any of the name ranges in the process, etc., etc. That was the last bit. So are there any questions? You can just chat if you want, unmuting yourself, or you can write a question for me on the chat function. Okay, if that was of use to you, I kind of need a favor. We're going to post this up on our YouTube channel. We're also going to post it through LinkedIn. You know, I wrote an article in our blog the other day about value chains. I think most of the people on the call are our user base. And I've just had a really good question, actually, I'll come back to in a moment, which again, I was going to cover off and I didn't. But yeah, so if you can, you know, share that video, give us your feedback on the video, whether it was helpful or not. And also comment in this particular webinar right now, what other bits of UniPhi would you like to see in a webinar? So this one came about because a client asked us to give us some information that was probably better through this methodology. So the question that's come in is, when would you use this Excel version of getting the data out versus Power BI? And my main thing is, you can dump data from Power BI to CSV. It's a little bit counterintuitive. So getting those CSV files for people, it's a lot easier just by having it in here as comma separated things and going file save as. So I probably would have ultimately filtered this screen for the casual by combining the 2 tables, and then just every week just file save as CSV, and away it goes. But also often I'll want to do a little calculation. So if I drop that out, I want to know, like, and you know, maybe a little bit more nuanced. It could be a financial quarter or a financial year, which I could drop down as a date filter with the entry date here. But I might want to know, like, hours per person, for example. And so in Excel, you know, you've got all your functions that you can now bring in that are a lot easier to do in Excel than it is in Power BI, in my opinion. Now, if I do it like this, it works fine. But what you would have seen in the first instance when I click on that is this get pivot data, which is quite a nuisance. Although you can try and do cell referencing and things like that to use get pivot data. The way around that is to just type in the reference instead. So in this instance, go B36, and it doesn't do the get pivot. If you're doing a function, it'll do it anyway. And all I want to do is know how many people I've got. Then I can go B37 divided by D36, and I get my answer, 2,176 people, 2,176 hours per person. That's a fun little task to do with some of our clients, to see how many hours are the standard hours in that company from different companies, and if there's industry differences and things like that. But look, there's a million formulas and other things you can use in Excel that are just so much easier to do than to do in Power BI. And so that'd be why I would use it. Yeah, no need to learn DAX, as Simon has mentioned. How can you validate your results? I mean, you can run those reports in UniPhi, I guess, but the data source is UniPhi, so I'm not sure what exactly we're validating. But if you are creating measures, you probably need to do some testing around those measures as well. So DAX is the PowerQuery stuff, actually. So it's more, sorry, DAX is the formats and the way you create formulas in Power BI. So when you're in Power BI and you create a new calculation, you're using a methodology called DAX. I mean, it's not totally dissimilar to the functions that you have in Excel, but it's just a little bit harder to use. So when you're using functions in Excel, that's doing calculations. When you're in Power BI, you can do similar thing, but it's using a concept called DAX, which is like a flat table connected to another flat table methodology for doing stuff rather than just cell references. It's a bit more dynamic. So I think because people are comfortable with Excel, I think this would be a far better way of getting data out. Then for your visuals, you can do your Power BI to get the nice graphs and charts. But for basic analysis, for example, on the weekend, I did this methodology for our revenue cash flow because we don't have a current cost profile uploaded for next financial year, just to get a margin, month-by-month margin analysis. I was able to then put what I knew the cost base was going to be month by month as a line in Excel. I had the revenue data coming up, which is project by project to build it up. I get the top line out of that, and I can do one minus the other and check on margin. And it was that sort of analysis that led to a job application today. So we're recruiting again. If you want to look at our LinkedIn site, it's got the jobs. If you know anyone interested and want to work in what I think is a pretty fun company to work for, please spread the word. So yeah, please feel free to interact with these posts when we put them up, and get in touch with us about other topics you'd like us to cover.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
No worries, guys. Thanks for joining. Really appreciate it. Really.
Thanks, Mark. That was really good.